They whispered that it had to be a pact, that no one moves like that unless they're backed by something unholy or divine. You walk into rooms with timing that breaks logic, the right words, the right moments, the doors that creak open just as others swear they're sealed shut. They call it luck because they don't want to admit its awareness. Because if they admitted that your rise came from attention to detail, from walking away when it cost you comfort, from trusting instincts over optics, they'd have to face their own laziness. Your movements aren't blessed by randomness. They're forged in pattern recognition, in silence, in rituals of invisible discipline. And since they didn't see the foundation being laid, they blame the sky for your altitude. They think you cut some cosmic corner. That maybe you said a prayer wrong, or right enough to hack the system. They don't understand that what they call luck is what happens when consequence aligns with preparation. You were studying when they were entertaining. You were detaching when they were over-explaining. You were mastering boredom. And that mastery created room for momentum to breathe through you. Now every outcome looks enchanted, but behind it was repetition. Hours of choosing what wasn't trending. Days of being mocked for the route no one else saw value in. And now they see the results but not the toll. So they whisper Pact, because Pact sounds easier to digest than process. You aren't lucky. You're aligned. You stopped gambling with your energy a long time ago. Every step you take now lands like fate because you removed chaos from the equation. You no longer react to distractions. You build through them. And that kind of clarity unsettles those still addicted to drama. They don't know how to interpret a person who doesn't need conflict to feel alive. They're used to explosions, not precision. You became quiet, focused, unmoved. And in that stillness, you became untraceable. So when you win, it feels to them like a spell was cast. But the only spell you needed was consistency no one respected until now. Your luck looks magical because they never watched you clean the internal mess. They didn't see the phase where you stopped lying to yourself. When you cut off every source of emotional leakage. When you stopped negotiating your standards for inclusion. That internal tightening is what made room for external breakthroughs. You didn't attract miracles, you made space for them. You stripped away the noise, the validation addiction, the impulse to over-explain your ambition. And in that emotional fast, you gained the type of momentum that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up as divine timing, as results that don't make sense to spectators, as blessings that feel unfair, only to those who never earned them. They don't understand how someone with no safety net walked so cleanly through chaos. But that's because they thought the net was under you. It was within. You fortified your mind while theirs was still waiting for consensus. You built resilience in the shadows, when no one clapped, when your voice trembled, when the only applause was your own resolve echoing through isolation. That kind of transformation doesn't come from a lucky break. It comes from breaking the version of yourself that tolerated mediocrity and rebuilding the one that commands movement without noise. So yes, your luck feels unfair, but only to those who confused convenience with preparation. They assume you struck a deal because they don't want to admit you developed discipline that made results inevitable. When someone doesn't flinch under pressure, doesn't over-celebrate wins, and doesn't collapse under attention, it feels foreign. And foreign gets labeled as supernatural. But there's nothing mystical about alignment. It's just rare. It's just unpopular. It's just too consistent for those who live in emotional currency. They think you skipped steps because you no longer need to scream to be heard. But your volume lowered because your energy speaks now. They hear it in the silence, and it terrifies them. You started listening to things they never even noticed. The energy shift when someone lies, the hesitation behind fake compliments, the enthusiasm that's too loud to be pure. You stopped filtering reality through social performance and started reading it raw. And because of that, your decisions look guided. But they weren't guided by chance. They were guided by emotional sobriety. You detoxed from chaos, from urgency, from the need to explain your path. Now every step you take seems perfectly timed. But it's not time you mastered, it's yourself. And they're scared because they can't predict you anymore. What they call a pact was really the moment you stopped asking for permission. The day you walked into discomfort like it was familiar. The second you stopped entertaining half-hearted people. That's when the air changed around you. When your presence started making people rethink how they speak, how they stand, how they look at themselves in your company. You didn't demand power. You made it impossible to ignore. And power that's subtle makes people think you're hiding something. But you're not hiding. You're just not performing anymore. And when the performance ends, the truth makes people flinch. They're trying to reverse engineer your life like it's a formula. But there is no formula. There's just the brutal honesty you made peace with. There's just the standards you stopped lowering. The battles you stopped fighting. The rooms you stopped entering. The ones you walked out of in silence that still echo with your absence. You didn't cast a spell. You cast a line and stopped pulling people who wouldn't swim. Now, all they see is someone who keeps rising in ways they can't explain. So they whisper Pact because they don't have the language for discipline that doesn't seek applause. So let them call it whatever helps them sleep. Pact spell. Divine interference. You don't need to correct them. Let them think you signed something cosmic. Because in a way you did. You signed a quiet contract with yourself. One that said you would no longer live on autopilot. One that committed to excellence without witnesses. That contract didn't require signatures. It required sacrifice. And you paid in full. Now every win feels supernatural to them, but it's just the interest compounding on every day you chose alignment over attention. Every time you chose restraint over reaction. Every time you bet on yourself without needing confirmation. That's not luck. That's liberation. They think you cut some cosmic corner because they never saw the slow deaths you endured in silence. The kind of deaths no one buries you for because you're still walking, still functioning, still posting, still polite. But you were grieving every time you gave loyalty to someone who only wanted access, every time you trusted someone who only wanted control, every time you spoke truth into a room full of ears trained to dismiss it. You didn't cut corners. You walked through fire without calling it a performance. You showed up to your own life without waiting for applause. And now that things are finally compounding, now that your peace is loud and your boundaries are louder, they want to claim you cheated. Because that's easier than admitting you stayed awake through seasons that would have put them to sleep. They think you made some backdoor deal with the universe because they didn't witness the nights where your only victory was not falling apart. They didn't feel the sting of your restraint when you could have retaliated but chose silence. They weren't there when you outgrew circles that still held your memories hostage. They think your growth is some divine anomaly. But no, it's just what happens when you stop begging for understanding and start building your own oxygen. You didn't slip through the cracks. You redesigned the floor. You chose discomfort over delay. You chose solitude over shallow connection. And that choice, that brutal, thankless, exhausting choice, is what they now label as luck. They see elevation, not excavation. They don't understand what had to be stripped away for you to move like this. They don't see the friendships you had to bury, the dreams you had to outgrow, the older version of yourself you had to confront, mourn, and unlearn. There's a cost to clarity, a price for alignment, and you paid in full while they were busy counting your blessings. They saw the surface, so they assumed you skipped steps. But steps don't show, scars do, and yours are invisible to anyone who only values visibility. That's why they whisper about shortcuts, because they never survived the long way through themselves. They never watched you let go of everything that used to define you. The roles you played to be accepted, the masks you wore to keep the peace, the people-pleasing, the over-explaining, the smiling through manipulation. You dropped it all, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And now that your peace is palpable, they're looking for ways to invalidate it. Because if they accepted the truth, that you earned every inch, they'd have to confront their own avoidance. And avoidance hates accountability. So it names your transformation as trickery. It calls your alignment arrogance. It calls your silence attitude. Anything but the truth. Because the truth would force them to evolve. You weren't favored. You were fed up. You were done being the most understanding person in rooms that weaponized your grace. You realized that every time you tolerated what you should have walked away from, you taught people how to treat you. And so you changed. You recalibrated. Not out of spite, out of exhaustion. You built a life that didn't need their approval. And now, as that life expands, they're reaching for explanations that don't hold weight, because they can't accept that someone they once knew now operates on a frequency they can't access. So they label it unfair, as if fairness ever built character, as if ease ever built discernment. They think something external granted you this energy, this insight, this calm authority, but it wasn't granted. It was grown, in private, in pain, in moments that looked like nothing from the outside, but rewired everything on the inside. You taught yourself how to be still when everything screamed, how to walk away without flinching, how to heal without a witness. They weren't watching when you learned to be comfortable being misunderstood. And now, when you move without fear of perception, they think you've hacked reality. But what you've done is far rarer. You've mastered yours. They confuse your detachment with disconnection. They think you stopped caring, but the truth is you stopped leaking. You used to pour yourself into every half-interested hand that reached for you. You used to believe in potential over patterns. Now you require effort. Now you wait. Now you observe. And that shift, that unnerves them, because people who are used to your emotional labor feel punished when you reclaim it. They feel abandoned when you stop over-functioning. And instead of adjusting, they accuse. Of luck. Of betrayal. Of changing. Because growth is betrayal to those who depend on your stagnation. They tell themselves you got lucky because the truth makes them uncomfortable. That while they were performing, you were paying attention. That while they were curating perception, you were studying intention. That while they were networking, you were aligning. You've stopped showing your process. And in the absence of transparency, they insert their own narrative. One where you must have cheated, must have coasted, must have found a loophole. Because if you didn't, if you actually earned it through inner warfare and relentless clarity, then they have no excuse. And that's the part they can't sit with. You became rare because you stopped diluting yourself. You stopped making yourself smaller to fit into what was available. You didn't wait for the world to hand you a better table. You built your own, and then you sat at it, alone if needed, in silence, in faith, in full power. And now the people who once asked you to shrink don't know how to stand beside you. They want your light without your story, your peace without your pain, your outcome without your origin. So they mythologize it, call it mysterious, call it a pact, call it divine favoritism. Anything but what it really is, a result. You didn't cut a cosmic corner. You took the long route with no map, no guide, and no cheering section. And you walked it anyway. Now you move like prophecy fulfilled. Not because the stars aligned, but because you finally did. Let them keep whispering. Let them guess. You owe no one the blueprint, only the aftermath. You rejected their validation, and without even raising your voice, you shifted the power dynamic. They were prepared for defiance, for dramatic exits, for fiery confrontations that they could label emotional instability. That's how their control worked. By pushing you into reactions they could then discredit. But you gave them none of it. You gave them distance. You gave them silence. And that silence didn't speak. It thundered. The absence of need, the calm refusal to audition for their approval, flipped the entire equation. You didn't raise your volume. You raised your value. And they didn't know how to respond to someone who no longer needed their applause to feel significant. They expected rebellion. They got evolution. And that shook the floor beneath their authority. Walking away with your dignity intact isn't passive. It's tactical. You knew their game wasn't about love, respect, or collaboration. It was about power dressed up as care. They offered acceptance like it was currency, like they were the gatekeepers to your own self-worth. And for a time, you bought it. You sought the nod. You adjusted your tone. You negotiated pieces of yourself just to stay in the room. But healing reconfigured your terms. You realized the cost of staying was your soul quietly evaporating, drip by drip, behind every smile that wasn't real. So you stopped performing. You didn't slam the door. You simply never knocked again. And that unbothered detachment, that broke them, because you weren't trying to win anymore. You were free. They counted on your insecurities to keep you predictable. They fed your fears subtle spoonfuls of shame, disguised as advice. They needed you to doubt yourself, because self-doubt was the lay used to keep you close. but you stopped reacting to criticism you didn't ask for. You stopped mistaking their disapproval for divine judgment. That alone inverted the hierarchy. When someone can no longer shake your confidence with a tone, they lose access to the one thing that made them feel powerful: your emotional volatility. You were once a mirror for their ego. Now you're a closed door, and they knock, not because they care, but because they can't stand being denied entry to what they used to manipulate with ease. You used to think validation was a bridge, that if you could earn it, you'd finally feel safe on the other side. But validation that must be chased is always conditional. It's built on someone else's fluctuating standards, someone else's unhealed perceptions. You realized this too late for comfort, but early enough to change the story. You stopped walking toward approval and started walking toward alignment. That shift made your world quieter, but it made your steps louder. Because power doesn't roar, it resonates. And now you walk with the echo of someone who doesn't care who's watching. You show up fully, not for admiration, for completion. And that scares them, because people who don't crave the spotlight can't be controlled by it. They expected you to explain, to justify, to soften the blow of your boundaries with long apologies. That's what they were really after. Your emotional labor dressed as politeness, but you declined, not rudely, just finally. And that was the beginning of their unraveling. They didn't fear your anger. They feared your indifference. Your detachment was a verdict. Not because you wanted revenge, but because you found peace they could no longer influence. When you stopped trying to make them comfortable in the presence of your truth, you rewrote the dynamic. They still talk like they have the upper hand, but they're talking to an empty room. You're gone, not blocked, unavailable. The most radical thing you did was stop caring whether they understood. You realized that comprehension isn't a requirement for your boundary to be valid, that you don't need agreement to enforce what protects your peace. You didn't argue. You just adjusted. And that quiet recalibration made you impossible to manipulate, because people who are still tethered to external approval will always fold under pressure. But you cut the cord. And now, when someone tries to push, there's nothing left to lean against. No emotional hook, no crack to wedge their guilt into. Just stillness, and that's power. Not loud, not flashy, but unshakable. They built their identity on being needed. And when you stopped needing them, their egos started leaking. That's why they circle back with subtle bait. Passive comments, nostalgic tones, half-hearted attempts to reconnect. But you've outgrown the pattern. You don't resent them. You don't romanticize the past. You've just recalibrated. Their value in your life was always based on an illusion, that they had something you lacked. Now that you've owned your own worth, their role is obsolete. You didn't remove them. You replaced the need. And when the need is gone, the dynamic collapses. They had the stage. You took away the audience. And the curtain never reopened. Every time you made yourself smaller to keep someone comfortable, you sent a signal to your nervous system. We aren't safe unless they approve. Healing taught you to reverse that message. To sit in your own discomfort until your nervous system learned a new response. One that didn't chase. One that didn't beg. One that didn't need the world to clap before you could breathe. Now you breathe on your own terms. You belong to yourself again. And those who were used to pulling emotional strings now hold a puppet with no strings left attached. That's the move they didn't see coming. You cut the invisible leash and smiled. They thought they had time, that you'd always be there.